I'm in the Women's Community Lounge and I've got a couple of people with me, which is great, Sangeeta and Ella. That's really good. And yeah, as Bodhi Naga said, we're in this series of Dharma for Difficult Times. So a series of talks in response to the pandemic we find ourselves in. And these talks about how the Dharma can help us in these difficult times, and how also we can transform if we use these difficulties to practice with. And actually I'm finding it's not even a choice, it's I'm forced into practicing by some of the challenges I face. And it's so important that this practice comes from ongoing kindness. We're in some really strange and unprecedented times. So it's not the time to be giving ourselves a hard time, rather it's a time for us to see how our practice can be of help to us, how we can, how it can help us. And as Bodhi Naga said, I'm talking about facing fear. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little bit of my own experience. Then I'm going to look quite briefly at 3 different suttas where the Buddha talks about fear. So hopefully in something that I say, there'll be something that you can relate to and you might find of use. So fear and anxiety have been very much in my experience, coming and going in different ways, and different types of fear and anxiety. So there's a fear that I've been experiencing in specific response to hearing about the suffering of other people. Sometimes people I know, sometimes people I don't know. I can find that fears triggered by news from other countries, speculation about the future. I can start to feel quite scared. And a lot of the time, there's a free floating anxiety that's lurking in the background or even foreground of my mind. And it looks like it's sort of seeking for something to attach itself to. It's like I'm on high alert and I don't know quite where the enemy is. And I'm kind of looking out to see where this anxiety might find a home. But the kind of most intense, scary time I've had was about 3 weeks ago. So one day my sister, who lives on her own in Manchester, messaged me. She said, let's not have our FaceTime that day as she was feeling too ill, which was odd actually, because she'd been off work for a week with a cold, but she'd been getting better. So I rang her and she could hardly speak. She could hardly speak. I couldn't really make out what she was saying. And I did manage to hear, though, that she was very ill. She had a fever, she was completely exhausted, and she couldn't do anything. And she'd rung the doctor and an ambulance was on its way. And I couldn't really get that bit. I got the gist that something was happening, but I couldn't really hear what was happening. So as you can imagine, that was quite anxiety provoking because I'm here in Sheffield, Debbie's in Manchester, sounding terribly distressed. And I felt like a real sudden rush of fear, of adrenaline, like a shock. And it was like I was in a different reality. It's like this was really happening because I kind of obviously read about coronavirus, but it was actually seemed to be happening to my sister and had quite a strong feeling this couldn't be real. And it was one of those very beautiful spring days, a bit like today, which made it even more surreal that I was kind of walking about the garden, kind of having this, trying to understand what my sister was trying to say to me. And I felt a really unpleasant and difficult mixture of both adrenaline and helplessness at the same time, because I really wanted to do something. You know, this is real serious, but something awful might happen to my sister, and I couldn't do anything apart from ringing her and texting her to check that she was okay. And the worst bit for me, I mean, I think the whole day was pretty horrible for my sister, but the worst bit for me was in the early evening because I rang her and she said, the paramedic is here now, which was great. So I said, okay, I'll get off the phone, but let me know what happens. So what felt like about 30 minutes, I'm not sure if it was that long, I just paced up and down in the car park here in the women's community, really dealing with my rising fear and the prapancha. What prapancha means is a proliferation of thoughts. It's when your thoughts start telling you all kind of stories. You know, so what if she does go into hospital? How will I know where she is? Could I go and see her? Is that sort of allowed? Etc., etc. Yeah, a lot of prapancha there. But anyway, the story ends really well. So the paramedic said that although he was 95% sure that Debbie was suffering from coronavirus and her temperature and her pulse were high, but everything else was okay. She didn't need to go to hospital. And then another paramedic came the next day and took more tests and she was okay. And she's also delivered some food as part of the crisis team, delivered her a food package. So she was really well looked after the system, which I found really reassuring actually. And she's loads better now, lots better, really keen to get back to work when she can. So that was quite an intense experience of fear. And I suppose the question I ask myself is, what did I learn dharmically from this? So first of all, how powerful fear is when I'm in its grip. So how the experience of helplessness made it harder. So apart from texting and phoning, I couldn't really do anything. How strong my view is that bad things shouldn't happen to me or the people I love, and how reality is different from how I want it to be. How, when I was pacing up and down the car park in the community waiting, well, actually I did use my training. It came to me naturally. The training I had of doing the mindfulness of breathing, coming back to my experience, noticing the prapancha, the thoughts, and coming back to my body, coming back to the breathing and the experience of the fear in my body. And how I also connected with Debbie, how precious she is to me, became very clear. And I also was able to bring to mind other people who might also be on the end of the phone with relatives or friends. And some of those might have had to go to hospital, and some of those might not have recovered as well. So a connection with other people, other people's dukkha, and a feeling of metta for myself and metta for other people who I don't even know. Yeah, and interestingly, because this does have a very happy ending, the story at the moment, although the experience was profound and intense, it's not maybe as difficult sometimes as the ongoing general anxiety of, well, what's going to happen next, where we're going to go. That can be kind of more painful, actually. And fear is a natural, very natural animal human response to danger. It's really important that we acknowledge that. There's nothing wrong about experiencing fear and anxiety. And in fact, experiencing fear can obviously save our lives. You know, it can get us out of trouble. But sometimes we experience misplaced fear and anxiety, and we can find ourselves paralyzed or maybe triggered to behave aggressively, or wanting to run away and hide under the duvet. When we experience a lot of anxiety and it's perhaps misplaced, it's not actually something that's going to do us so much harm. We might experience ongoing, sustained and debilitating anxiety, and that causes us and others unnecessary and sometimes quite extreme suffering. And also that fear and that anxiety means we limit ourselves, and maybe we don't respond with the kindness and openness to others, which we'd really like. And I guess that many of us would have experienced some of these in the last few weeks. So fear itself is natural while we are not enlightened. So fear is natural. We're going to experience fear while we're not enlightened. But what we can change is how we respond to our fear and to our anxiety. So, so what did the Buddha have to say about fear? So let's hear from the Buddha in the rather wonderfully named Fear and Dread Sutta. So the Buddha says, before my awakening, when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, the thought occurred to me. It's not easy to endure isolated forest or wilderness dwellings. It's not easy to maintain seclusion, not easy to enjoy being alone. The forests, as it were, plunder the mind of a monk who has not attained concentration. So it's kind of interesting that in these times where we find ourselves, many of us, we're isolated, perhaps not by choice. He's saying how being in an isolated situation is frightening. He says it's not easy to maintain seclusion, not easy to enjoy being alone. And then the forests, as it were, plunder the mind of a monk who has not attained concentration. I love that phrase, plunder the mind. I think it's a great way to describe that inability to think clearly when we're under the influence of fear and anxiety. It's like that bit of us seems to disappear that can think with perspective and think logically. So the Buddha then goes on to say, so what if I, whatever state I'm in when fear and terror come to me, what if I were to subdue that fear and terror in that very state? So when fear and terror came to me while I was walking back and forth, I would not stand or sit or lie down. I'd keep walking back and forth until I'd subdued that fear and terror. When fear and terror came to me when I was standing, I wouldn't walk, sit or lie down. I'd keep standing until I subdued that fear and terror. And then he goes through lots of different ways of being, lying down, standing up, sitting down. And basically what he says is whatever he was doing when the fear came to him, he would stay with that fear. He'd stay with it. He'd stay with the experience. He wouldn't do anything else. And there's a word in that he uses a few times, which is subdue, which I think can make me feel a bit, but I think to me, I'm not hearing it to mean suppress. It's not meaning suppressing the fear, kind of pretending everything's all right. Far from it. For me, I think it's about, like he's saying, he's going to stay with his experience of fear and dread until that feeling passes away naturally. That's what I'm reading the subdue to mean. And when he was able to do this, he found that unflagging persistence was aroused in me and unmuddled mindfulness established. Unmuddled mindfulness, sounds great. My body was calm, my mind concentrated and single, quite withdrawn from sensuality, withdrawn from unskillful mental qualities. I entered and remained in the first dhyana. Rapture and pleasure born from withdrawal, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. So this is a description of the Buddha passing into higher states of consciousness. So by him staying with his experiences, his sensations of fear and anxiety, it led him into calm and concentrated states. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because I think that's kind of not what we might imagine would happen. And I've got a few thoughts on perhaps why staying with the physical sensations, even though they're unpleasant, can actually help us to become calmer. So the first, I think, is that if we're in our body and what's going on with our breath, with the sensations in our body, we're not in prapancha. So we might find ourselves going away on these thoughts about around the fear and terror. But if we come back to what we're actually experiencing in that moment, that means we're no longer in prapancha. If we stay with our experience as well, we learn how it is we feel when we're anxious and when we are experiencing fear. And we might, because we learn how we feel, whether it's like sensations in our stomach, a tightness in our chest, changes in our breath, because we're aware of that, that means that if we start to become anxious and we notice that in our body, we can have some awareness of our own anxiety. And that can allow us not to respond so automatically. So maybe not jump into that irritation or anger, not jump into that feeling frozen, not sure what to do. We can think, oh, I am anxious. We can be in the gap with our anxiety and not blame somebody else or ourselves for it, but just notice there's anxiety arising. And when we're aware of that anxiety arising in ourselves, well, as well as maybe stopping for a bit and thinking about what we're doing, we can also bring kindness to ourselves and others. So we can bring metta to ourselves in that situation. Perhaps we can even do some form of metta bhavana in that situation, wishing ourselves well, wishing other people well. And I'm not sure. I've read that if we are experiencing metta, we're not experiencing fear. So no fear, no metta. And I think that's just something for us to experiment with and see if that's our experience, that when we're feeling metta for ourselves, for other people, we're not experiencing fear. And I think, another thing we learn is that our sensations change. So we might feel anxiety and fear arising in our bodies, but if we stay with it, we notice that those sensations change and they move on to something else, which can allow us, I think, to start to have the courage to really feel that fear and know that, I suppose a lot of the problem is being very afraid of being afraid, and that we don't need to be that, because it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to feel fear, and we can manage that in ourselves and we can be okay. But there is a huge kind of warning with this, is that I think even though the Buddha wasn't enlightened yet in this sutta, he was pretty experienced and had lots of years of meditation, lots of practice, and a very ethical lifestyle. And we might not be as experienced as that. So what we might need to do is sometimes choose a positive distraction. I think particularly at the moment when fear and anxiety can be pretty high, we might do a little bit of going towards our anxiety. And if it feels like it's going to overwhelm us, then maybe what we need to do is go, okay, well, just for now, I'm going to choose a positive distraction. So maybe we could do some exercise, because moving our bodies can be quite good. Watch a good film, read a book, do something, talk to a friend, something that allows us for a little while to be distracted positively. And we're making a choice to do that. And then we'll come back, and then we can just maybe come back to our anxiety again when it's calmed down a bit. Okay, so that's the sutta about staying with our experience of fear and dread. Now I'm going to talk about a second sutta, and this sutta is called Freed of the Fivefold Fear. So freed of the fivefold fear. It's a very alliterative, almost a tongue twister. Freed of the fivefold fear. And it outlines 5 fears. And these fears are the fear of losing our livelihood, the fear of disrepute, which I think is like having a bad reputation with people, the fear of embarrassment while speaking in assemblies, the fear of death, and the fear of an unhappy future destiny. So it's kind of really interesting that even at the time of the Buddha, that public speaking was a serious fear, up there with death. And I'm not sure if speaking to Zoom counts as speaking to an assembly, but anyway. So those are 5 fears that the Buddha talks about. And then he talks about 4 powers. He says, "O monks," and by monks he means practitioners. He means everybody, all practitioners. 4 powers. What 4? The power of wisdom, the power of energy, the power of an unblemished life, which is ethics, and the power of generosity. So wisdom, energy, ethical life, and generosity. And I'm just going to briefly talk about each of these in turn. So wisdom. So some of my suffering that I experienced around Debbie's situation, and also more particularly actually really my general anxiety, comes from feeling kind of this really shouldn't be happening. Not to me, not in my country, not in Sheffield, not to people that I know, this shouldn't be happening. But of course I know intellectually from all these years of studying the Dharma that, things are impermanent, and there is dukkha in conditioned existence. There is dukkha. So there's something about the more that we can know impermanence and dukkha in my guts and in my heart, the more I'm not going to be afraid when I experience suffering and impermanence, because I'm not going to have that tension of thinking this just shouldn't be happening. I think also the more that we can realize how interconnected we are with the rest of life, and that we have a wrong view that I've got a fixed and separate self that I need to try and protect at all costs, the less we'll suffer as well. So the more that we are connected with other people, have a sense of a much bigger picture. So the less that I see myself as being this, the center of the universe, and understand the reality that there are, billions of other people on this planet, lots of other life forms on this planet, all of us interconnected in many ways. The more I realize that, the more I realize that wisdom and really know it, the less that I will suffer from fear. I think also we can, in this wisdom section, we can use the fact that we can reflect. We could reflect on what we're anxious about. Is it based on speculation? Something in the future that we can't predict? Something that, that actually it's not really worth spending time being anxious on, because it's beyond our control. And I guess the changes, in the last 4 weeks mean that we can really know that we can't predict the future. We can't predict the future. So perhaps we can just try and reflect and bring a perspective when we are feeling very anxious. So the second one here is energy, the power of energy. So this is the word virya, and virya means energy for the good. So it doesn't mean at all that we have to be immensely energetic and busy at all. Rather, it means that we're using our time and our resources in positive ways that will help us to grow, help us to become kinder, help us to become more open, help us to become more integrated. So for many of us, we can feel like we're made up of many different selves. We've got different needs and wants in the world. Some selves really want to be kind of maybe nun-like or monk-like and really practice Buddhism all the time. Others want to be out partying. Others love that we practice the Dharma. some of them ourselves hate that we do. There's like a sense there's lots of different selves within us. And some of our suffering comes from the fact that the more unintegrated we are, the more we'll have this tension of different selves. So I think the more integrated we are, the more of us that is behind our practice, the more of our lives we're practicing in, whatever our lifestyle is, the more of our lives we're practicing in, the less fear we'll experience. And actually, as I said, it doesn't mean rushing about at all necessarily. It might actually mean we need to rest a bit more in order to replenish our energy, that maybe we need to stop a bit from frantic, anxiety-driven activities. And a lot of people at the moment, aren't they, talking about how having a little bit more time allows people to really appreciate nature, really enjoying flowers, enjoying the buds on the trees, the blossom, in a way that sometimes maybe we don't have enough time to do that. So actually, energy might mean using our energy in a different way. And then the fourth one in this list is generosity, the final one in this list, but also it's in many other Buddhist lists. So why is that? Why is generosity so important that it's in so many lists? So I think for me, it's because in order to be generous, I need to take attention from myself to another or to other people. So instead of being self-obsessed and just thinking about what can I do to meet my needs, I need to actually think what somebody else might need or want and see if I can go about somehow giving that to them. And of course, there's many examples of both extraordinary and ordinary generosity at the moment. People making great sacrifices to help other people. People, moving out of their family house so that they can work in an intensive care unit or something like that. People really making massive sacrifices. And then just the ordinary generosity, the kindness of like people, maybe on your street, you might be experiencing that, for instance. So yeah, there's a lot of generosity at the moment. And as well as doing things that are generous, another thing that we can do for people is we might bring someone to mind and wish them metta. So we might not actually be able to do something for somebody because they're not in the same house as us, or we're not in contact with them, but we could still wish them metta, and that will really that's an act of generosity that will have an effect on us and an effect on them. And also, I think if we are feeling fear and anxiety, what we could do is we could connect imaginatively with all the other people who are feeling the same anxiety and fear as we are, and we could imagine them free of that fear. So there's something about using our actual experience, if that is anxiety, to bring to mind other people who are also suffering from anxiety and imagining that they are free of that anxiety, wishing them well. And of course, we'll be in there as well, wishing ourselves well too. Yeah. So in one of the lists, one of the things we can give is the generosity of fearlessness. So being around somebody who's calm and steady is really reassuring at the moment. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong for us to express our own anxieties and our own fears. In fact, it can be helpful to others and to ourselves to know that we're feeling anxious. And actually, it's also connecting if somebody tells us about their anxieties that we share as well. That can be really connecting. For me, I think it's more that we might think carefully about how we express our anxiety. So instead of adding to the general kind of speculation and rumour going on, which is the kind of thing I often want to do actually, but instead of adding to that, we can try to stick with what we actually know. And we can think about the effect that our anxiety might be having on other people and bring that into our awareness and perhaps do something about that. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly mention the third sutta. So we are hearing a lot from the Buddha today. So this is the Banner Sutta. So in this sutta, the Buddha talks about how in a battle, a soldier who might be experiencing fear or terror or suffering from their hair standing on end might look for the banner of the general. So, like I can imagine this battlefield, which is really hectic, loads of people arm to arm fighting. Some poor soldier who doesn't even want to be there, who's probably been forced into it, just thinking, what's going on? And looking for the banner of their general, because they know if they move towards that, that's going to be where their kind of side, their side of the war that's going on is going to be. So the Buddha uses that metaphor and says that if anyone who's practicing the Dharma should experiencing fear or terror or suffer from the hair standing on end, let them behold the crest of my own banner. If you do so, any fear, terror, or hair standing on end arising in you will pass away. And he says, if you experience the fear when you've gone to the forest or you're in a lonely place in an empty house, then think of the Buddha, and think of the qualities of the Buddha, this Buddha, this blessed one. Or if you can't think of the Buddha, then think of the Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha. And if you can't think of the Dharma, then think of the Sangha, so the disciples of the Buddha, the disciples who are wise conduct, of dutiful conduct, and then any fear may arise will pass away. So this in a way is a metaphor for that traditional image of going for refuge to the Buddha, to the Dharma, and to the Sangha. And one way that we can reflect on, we can bring the Buddha to mind, is to reflect on a Moga Siddhi or green Tara. And these are two archetypal figures associated with the quality of fearlessness of the enlightened mind. So both figures are green in colour, which is interesting, so a kind of very natural colour. A Moga Siddhi has the Mudra of Fearlessness. So this is the Mudra of Fearlessness. And it's really worth doing, actually. There's something about that hand, putting your hand like that, which really helps me anyway. So you could experiment with, if you're in the grip of anxiety, what is it to be like a Moga Siddhi with the Mudra of Fearlessness? And green Tara, of course, has a gentle strength that we can bring to mind. Perhaps if you know her mantra, you could chant her mantra. You could learn her mantra if you don't know it already. So I'm just coming towards the end of the talk. So I've covered quite a lot of areas, but some of them are that fear and anxiety can be overwhelming and it can plunder our minds. But we can work with fear and anxiety, as the Buddha demonstrated. So we can be in the gap, we can do the mindfulness of breathing, be in the present moment, move towards our experience of fear. We can use metta. Where there is metta, there is no fear. We can bring wisdom to our experience, asking ourselves, is this fear and anxiety based on speculation or on a realistic appraisal of the situation? Are we trying to deny impermanence and dukkha? We can put our energy into our practice, whatever our lifestyle is. We can live an ethical life. The more we practice the precepts, the less we need to experience the anxiety and fear of an uneasy mind. We can be generous, thinking about other people, giving to them, including wishing them metta. By calling the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha to mind when we're experiencing fear, just like a soldier on a battlefield might look for the general's banner, so we can go for refuge. And we can bring an archetypal figure to mind, which embodies the fearless aspect of the enlightened mind. So I'm just going to finish by reading a few verses from a puja, which is a ritual. And it's a ritual to green Tara, the figure of green Tara. The ritual is called Midnight Star, and it's written by an order member called Vasantra. And so these verses are: mysterious queen in the deep midnight of despair, where there is no safety, no clarity, no certainty, you appear with your gift bestowing hand. You hold the double Vajra in which all opposites unite. May I accept the wisdom that you offer, see beyond the prison of duality, and emulate your still activity. Where samsara and nirvana fuse and disappear, there I go for refuge. Where birth and death fuse and disappear, there I go for refuge. Where wisdom and compassion fuse and appear everywhere, there I go for refuge.